It's really interesting to see those maps, the ones that the BBC finally published, showing these the ridges and just the geographical stranglehold that the Israeli army is still has and is trying to consolidate more of in Gaza. I mean, of course, what is it now? Like almost, it's still about 55, 56% of the entire Gaza Strip is under Israeli control still.
Yeah, I mean, depending on where
Yeah.
these yellow lines end up
Yeah.
being, the original assumption was 53%, there was some at 58%, but if they're expanding it by 500 meters
Yeah.
in the tiny Gaza Strip, you're swallowing up many more percentages than that and also it's not just a line like people can hang out right up against the
Right.
border. They enforce the line with a shoot to kill on the other
Right.
side of the line. So there's a buffer zone on the other side of the buffer zone. And that is something that people
Yeah.
in Gaza have known from the era of Israeli settlements. And of course, in the West Bank, that's how we're seeing the land be stolen in the West Bank, creating buffer zones around settlements that are
Yeah.
illegal or outposts that are illegal. And then they enforce a buffer zone around it, which effectively steals, considerably more land than the actual settlement itself does. So,
Yeah, that's what they're doing in Masaferyata, which I highlighted in the news report, in which Tamara has been reporting as well. They've designated the areas around the villages as like live fire zones or closed military zones. They claim that they're turning it into a military base, but what they're really doing, obviously, is trying to expand the settlements there and just steal Palestinian land in broad daylight, which is the entire
yeah, and that
political
that
project
theft
of
came from the
Israel.
Oslo process when they
Yeah,
put in a footnote. The
yeah,
Israelis put in a footnote that military bases would not be removed as part of the Oslo process.
yeah,
And so Israel used that pretext that they said everything's a military base, everything's
right.
a shooting range,
Yeah,
in order to take vast swaths of the Jordan Valley, and also in the Hebron Hills area that you're talking about.
yeah, yeah. So that's essentially what they're trying to do in Gaza. Um, it's
It's a difficult situation
horrific.
because for the resistance, the only way the resistance can deal with this is to open back up the war,
Yeah,
and the
yeah,
way the people of Gaza have suffered, it puts the resistance in a really difficult place because people are trying to, especially before the winter, trying to get the little bit of aid that Israel is not delivering that they
right.
promised through the agreement. But there's nobody really to stick up for the resistance. The Israelis and the Kushners and the Witkoffs. This is all just by Trump's fiat. This whole
Right,
deal is Trump's fiat.
Well, not even the other so-called mediators apparently are sticking up for them.
right.
But there's a few things I've been monitoring that relate to this that we could take a look at, and some developments on the topic we discussed last week, which was the so-called International Stabilization Force, which this Trump plan calls for. So, um, really, I mean, just to begin with, a couple of stories in the Washington Post that, in a way, illustrate some of what John is talking about. And again, referring back to our discussion last week, that first one, which was published on just earlier this week, I think on Tuesday, Israelis bristle as Trump makes clear who calls the shots in Gaza truce. And this sort of elaborates on some of what we discussed last week, which is how much control, the direct control the US is exerting over Israel with this unprecedented joint operations center set up at Kiryat Gat with 200 US troops. And we have some quotes in the Washington Post. The Americans aren't just involved, they're leading it. Israel is merely participating, said Brigadier General Ran Kochav, a former air and missile defense commander in the Israeli military. Anywhere in the world where the Americans deploy a joint task force, they push everyone else aside and take command, control, and leadership of the operational activity, Brigadier General Kochav said. He adds, no one in Israel is comfortable with the current situation, referring to discontent in the Israeli military. Then they quote longtime Israeli military correspondent Amos Harel, writing in the Haaretz newspaper that, quote, defense officials have the impression that American scrutiny of Israel has reached a point that usurps Israel's military and diplomatic power. For the first time, America has placed troops in Israel to monitor the ceasefire, said Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the United States. He added, they're monitoring us and they're restricting our movements. So what's interesting there is it just we'll get to this now in the next story, but that paints a picture of really the US calling all the shots, literally,
Yep.
and this being entirely a US led operation. So everything we see happening on the ground is approved of, if not directly ordered by the US. And then the question is, what does this mean for the so called ceasefire? Well, let's take a look at the next story, which was published on Wednesday, I believe, and this was the day after uh, the ceasefire, the Israeli strikes
Yeah.
on overnight Wednesday, which killed more than 100 people, including 46 children. And this story says, just a couple of details. Um, Hamas described the strikes in Gaza as a violation of the ceasefire deal and said there was a clear Israeli intention to undermine the ceasefire agreement and impose new realities by force. Hamas is committed to the ceasefire agreement, and we call on the mediators to take immediate action to compel the occupation to implement the terms of the agreement, said Hamas official Tahir Nounu, according to Palestinian media. In a statement, this is from the Washington Post, the Israeli military said the strikes hit dozens of terror targets and terrorists and named 26 people it said were militants killed in the attacks. In a statement, the Hamas run government media office said that some of the names were incorrect or made up, and that others listed by the military were either still alive or killed earlier in the war. So that just recalls something we've seen. I know John has commented on many times over the past 2 years, Israelis just making up names or just pulling random lists of names as a pretext for these massacres that are really just about imposing collective punishment. Then
Yeah.
we come to the key question of, is the US going to do anything to restrain these bombing attacks? And here the Washington Post says, quote, there was no indication, however, that the US sought to rein in the Israeli strikes. And as the bombardment began Tuesday evening, President Trump said that he expected Israel to hit back if a soldier is killed by enemy fire, and repeated his threat that if Hamas is, quote, not good, they're going to be terminated. So as John pointed out, that's rhetoric we've heard before. So this uh, um, sort of extreme or unprecedented level, so the Israelis say, of U.S. support doesn't in any way interfere with Israel's ability to murder Palestinians at will. And in fact, it never has, because the US has always been, let's say, the engine behind this occupation.
It's
One of
interesting to see, sorry, it's just interesting to see how honestly, the US is proving that this is how the sausage is made, like this is how US empire works. This is, it was never Israel calling the shots. It's always been an American project or American led project for the ethnic cleansing and colonization of Palestine. And so it's just kind of notable that we can see that the veneer is completely gone now. And CENTCOM literally has a base inside, a settlement in Palestine, where it is very proud to publicly be the ones who are literally, as you said, calling the shots here.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting note.
Yeah, one other interesting thing from this Washington Post article, um, as John mentioned, and as you've reported, Nora, the Israeli pretext for this particular massacre was they claimed a soldier was killed. They've actually named him. It's a West Bank settler
Yeah.
who was in Rafah, but we don't know the circumstances. As John says, this is a devastated terrain, and we know that the previous massacre, which happened a week ago, last Sunday, a
Yeah.
week previous to the most recent Sunday, that they also blamed Hamas for an attack. And then there were reports that you mentioned last week from Ryan Grimm at Dropsite News that the US knew that it wasn't an attack by resistance fighters. It was an Israeli vehicle, a heavy, they said bulldozer or
Yeah.
excavator that had run over either an improvised explosive device or perhaps some of the unexploded Israeli ordnance that litters Gaza. So, for all we know, the same thing could have happened to this uh, Israeli settler soldier. We don't know. We don't have any independent way to verify this. But we do have this quote in the Washington Post from, um, it says, the Israeli Defense Force identified the soldiers Yona Ephraim Feldbaum, 37, from the Combat Engineering Corps. At an event in New York on Wednesday, Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman al-Thani said he believed the attack that killed Feldbaum, quote, was a violation, end quote. We were expecting there would be a response from Israel, he said, speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations. So I just think, it's remarkable if that's the attitude of the so-called mediators, to
Yeah.
accept Israel's word at face value and to say, well, and to shrug and to say, yeah, we knew they'd attack. I mean, the, if those comments are representative of the attitude, then it shows uh, no effort
Yeah.
whatsoever to counterbalance uh, the Israeli and American uh, narrative and approach. Perhaps not that surprising, but notable nonetheless.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
why does Israel get to continue to carry out military operations? The way that that's framed makes it sound like there's a bunch of Israelis that are just kind of sitting on their lunch boxes during a ceasefire and someone shot them and then that needs to be responded to. That's not what happened. You have the
What is
entire
combat
unit.
engineering, John? Why don't you remind us what combat engineering is?
They're destroying people's houses. They're carrying on with the exact same operation that Gideon's chariots was. They're going row by row, street by street, destroying people's houses actively. Sometimes they hit unexploded ordnance. Sometimes they hit, like you said, there's many things that could set an excavator on fire, and it's in a territory that Israel completely controls. So the first people that you would look towards would be the gangs that Israel that work in coordination with Israel. You wouldn't think of a resistance fighter traversing into that area to carry out an operation to undermine the ceasefire that is getting food to their families for the first time in many months. So there's no resistance objective that's met by attacking these Israeli soldiers. When you read about it in the newspaper in North America or hear from these mediators, you think that these Israeli soldiers are just hanging out
Planting
there.
flowers,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
just they're all sitting around
Right.
talking because there's a ceasefire. They're working full time, two divisions of combat engineers, many of them West Bank settlers who are very jazzed to be destroying Palestinian property. And now they have this yellow line that is essentially an invincibility cloak that allows them not only to not be targeted, but if they are targeted, they get to return to full scale war. It's just,
Yeah.
yeah, it's this is a very difficult point in this war because Um, the resistance listened to the population who are their families who were in desperate situation with winter coming on, and they massive gamble, trusted that Trump's word would keep this ceasefire in place. And the civil military coordination was something from the negotiations, because the resistance wanted some kind of observation, like who's going to be the person to say when the ceasefire is violated by Israel. So they said, well, we'll set up this civil military coordination center, which ostensibly would be the one who would report the violation by Israel of the ceasefire, rather than be the ones who facilitate Israel carrying out these strikes. So what every day when we learn more about what Israel and Trump believe the ceasefire is, it's elastic. The
Yeah.
lines, the ceasefire lines are elastic. The targeting reasons are elastic. It's just it, it's a bad omen.
Yeah.
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 It
Well, so,
portends a trajectory of an ongoing war where one side attacks the other, and the other, at risk of their families being genocided, um, can't respond,
Yeah.
and
can't
that's
properly respond.
very similar to the situation in Lebanon right now, where Israel is attacking on a daily basis, escalating its attacks, killing people, destroying infrastructure in Lebanon, and the resistance can't respond for slightly different reasons in Lebanon that have to do with the politics within Lebanon, but nonetheless, it's a similar dynamic. Some of the issues that you just mentioned, John, and that we discussed last week with what comes next after this s- so-called first phase, as you emphasized strongly last week, uh, the Hamas only signed up to the first stage of Trump's uh, so-called peace plan, which had to do with the ceasefire, letting in humanitarian aid, and exchanging prisoners, and nothing else. All the stuff about disarmament and all of that, they didn't agree to, even though the United States is behaving as if Hamas signed up to all 20 points, including disarmament and demilitarization, which is just not the case. It's not true for Hamas or the other resistance factions because it's a united front. Now, this morning we have this article from Barak Ravid, the Israeli journalist in Axios. The headline there is "Scoop: U.S. pushing to finalize plan for international Gaza security force." Now, Barak Ravid is basically reliably conveys whatever the officials who fed him the story want us to know or to read. So that's, I think, how you have to understand this. But that headline is somewhat misleading because it gives the impression that this is all just about wrapped up and all the Americans have to do is put a bow on it. But when you read the article itself, it becomes clear that they really are at an impasse in so many ways. And I want to get into some of what the article says because I think it's very revealing and get your all of your thoughts on it. So it says US officials have been holding sensitive conversations with a range of countries about establishing an international force to deploy to Gaza and intend to present a plan in the next few weeks. Three sources intimately involved in that process tell Axios. So they intend to present a plan in the next few weeks. That's a very elastic phrase. Um, and they say the U.S. Central Command is taking the lead in drafting a plan for the force. A U.S. official said it involves a new Palestinian police force to be trained and vetted by the U.S., Egypt, and Jordan alongside troops from Arab and Muslim countries. So you see here the commitment to a collaborator force,
Mhm.
similar to the colonial police auxiliaries that the British Empire and other empires set up around the world. So these should be Palestinians handpicked and vetted by the US, which means by Israel, and working with states or trained by states that are vassals of the United States. So this is about, uh, they're sticking with the plan of creating a collaborative force. And they say um, countries including Indonesia, Azerbaijan, Egypt, and Turkey have shown willingness to contribute troops, the sources said. Others raised concerns with the US given the chaotic security situation in Gaza. So, again, the language here, uh, they have shown willingness. I mean,
Yeah,
that's,
that's
again,
very
not
aspirational.
very aspirational. And then they point to some of the issues, some of which we discussed last week. Um, and this is very interesting. Well, actually, yeah, there's this quote here. If we don't have reliable security and governance in Gaza that the Israelis agree to, we will get stuck in a situation where Israel is attacking all the time, one source involved in the planning said. So that, again, goes to show the dangers here. And then Barak Ravid writes, but that all depends, in other words, getting this force in, all depends on Hamas agreeing to give up its authority and at least some of its weapons. Some on the right in Israel and the US argue that the group will never do so voluntarily, so Israel will inevitably have to resume the war. The massive and deadly Israeli airstrikes in response to an alleged Hamas attack in Rafah on Tuesday made that appear all the more likely. US officials are desperate to avoid a resumption of the war and see the ISF, the International Stabilization Force, as a key part of the puzzle, but not one that can be rushed. It is better to move slow and get it right because we are not going to have a second chance, a senior US official told Axios. And then, um, anyone want to comment on this point? Because
Yeah, well,
yeah.
Hamas has given up government. That they did that over a year ago when they said that the Community Support Council would take over, a government of technocrats would take over. So that has already long ago been a position of Hamas's, but the stabilization force is not. So this needs to be negotiated, and presumably they're waiting while the conflict in Gaza, while uh, Qassam and the Ministry of the Interior are fighting these collaborator gangs that Trump said he wanted them to do and gave them some period of time to do. Internal security in Gaza is handled by Hamas. It's handled by the government, and the police force is a civilian police force. So these things already exist. They don't need to be done through this international stabilization force, which presumably this stabilization force is only going to operate in the yellow line areas, not in Gaza itself. So you end up having what looks like a secondary force because the Palestinians across the board have been very clear that they do not want an international force, that a force will be considered an occupying force. And the way that this is structured in this agreement, it absolutely is an occupying force. So um, I'm not very confident about this next stage of the negotiations.
Well, that's nor are they. So
Yeah.
that's clear
They're scrambling.
in the next part of this article, where Barak Ravid says that the ISF, the International Stabilization Force, was a key topic of discussion in the meetings Trump's envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio had during their recent visits to Israel, the sources said. A senior Israeli official said the US side presented its ideas about the size of the force, while the Israelis stressed that the size matters far less than its legitimacy with the local population and willingness to fight and kill if needed. So you can see what the Israeli goal here is. They want uh, uh, Palestinian traitors and Arab traitors to go in and finish the job of destroying the resistance that the vaunted Israeli army was unable to do. They want Palestinian traitors to go into Gaza to fight and kill other Palestinians if needed. Quote,
which is a
the,
non-starter for the
well, but
resistance.
Yeah.
this is what Israel wants.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, they're trying to set up a free Gaza, right? You've heard that terminology on the other side of the yellow line, that there would be this free Gaza where the collaborators and the gangs and the thieves will all hang out, presumably with this security force, and not interact with the Gaza population, which is all on the other side of on the western side of the yellow line in the urban
Well,
centers.
it's not entirely clear how far they want to go.
That's true
They
too.
clearly they would have to start behind the yellow line, but it's not clear that they want to stop there. But this U.S. official quoted by Barak Ravid says, "quote The Israelis are nervous and skeptical because they're not in control and they don't have the cards anymore. We told them let's create the right circumstances and see if Hamas is serious or not." And then Barak Ravid points out the obvious here, what we've been saying. Few countries are prepared to send their troops to fight Hamas or get caught in the crossfire between Hamas and rival groups, not to mention Hamas and Israel. Turkey is prepared to participate, but Israel opposes any Turkish presence in Gaza. However, the US wants Turkey involved along with Qatar and Egypt because it sees them as best able to get Hamas to agree and to behave, according to a US official. That language of behaving we heard from
Yeah.
Donald Trump as well. Quote, the Turks were very helpful in getting the Gaza deal, and Netanyahu's bashing Turkey has been very counterproductive, the US official said. We are aware of the Israeli concerns and are working to create something that can achieve stability and that both sides can find acceptable, the official said. Now, this mention of both sides is interesting because who is the other side? Well, it turns out that the other side here is Hamas, and it says um, from Barak Ravid, he says a primary goal right now is to get Hamas to agree to the ISF's deployment, according to a source who is deeply involved in the process. Quote, if you are going into an environment where Hamas sees you as an occupying force, it will be hard. But if Hamas consents, it's a different situation, the source said. In such a scenario, the ISF wouldn't have to fight a war against Hamas, but only enforce the peace and fight elements that try to interfere. So you
Such as
have,
Israel? Like,
well,
is this
but you have
insane?
goals that are completely at odds for this
Yeah,
force because
yeah,
they understand that they can't send in soldiers against the wishes of Hamas, and on the other hand, Israel only wants a force that is going to go in and fight Hamas.
right.
So these are fundamentally incompatible goals.
Yeah.
And then finally, here we're getting sort of to the crux of this. U.S. and Israeli officials say that, as expected, Hamas is using the ceasefire to reconstitute and restore its grip on Gaza, as if, of course, as John just pointed out, Israel isn't continuing its operation
Right.
during the ceasefire. But the officials added that the current situation on the ground, with the border uh, with Egypt blocked and Israel still controlling half of Gaza, limits Hamas's ability to rearm and rebuild. Hamas has a pretty low glass ceiling now, a US official said. Now, um, the key point here is they say that no matter what happens, uh, so they say
Mm.
Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey told the US that Hamas could agree to the deployment of the ISF, a US official said. Based on discussions with Hamas, the mediators think the group would agree to the ISF monitoring the borders and possibly conducting missions inside Gaza. So they might find some formula to let them in, but not to fight. But the key point that this article comes to is that it says that although this is a very difficult process that may not succeed, in the end, the leverage they have is that they control the borders and the amount of humanitarian aid coming in, which
Mhm.
notably has not increased. And so this underlines the fear I think many of us have, is that having failed in 2 years of genocide and war to destroy the resistance, having failed to get the resistance to just surrender its
Surrender.
weapons, they will fail to put together a collaborator force willing and able to disarm the resistance. So the default will be to uh, maintain the starvation siege and basically to go back to uh, full scale war, or even 50% scale war. I don't
Mhm.
know what, some kind
Mhm.
of lower level uh, ongoing bombardment, all under the guise of a ceasefire. So
Right.
that's all to say they haven't made progress despite this headline trying to spin it. They are trying to square an impossible circle. They're not likely to succeed. In the meantime, Israel is going to unpick the ceasefire. They're not facing any pushback from the Americans so far. On the contrary, the Americans seem to be approving it. And things are not changing on the ground for people in Gaza. So it's a somewhat bleak assessment, I have to say, but that is a lesson and a message to us to remain absolutely focused and
Yeah.
mobilized in terms of continuing to draw attention and put pressure on every
Yeah.
complicit element that we can to stop aiding and abetting this genocide, to stop the arms supply to Israel. Sanctions are needed more than ever.
Yeah.
None of this is over by any stretch.
No.
It's
No, it's just oh, go ahead.
these are just very confused plans, as if you can even call them plans. It just seems to be a lot of talk, a lot more wish casting. As complicit as Turkey has been with Israeli genocide and Israeli war crimes and the Israeli economy over many years, I don't see Turkey fighting against Hamas on the ground on behalf of Israel.
No one is going to. No,
Like
no one, no one
No.
who
it
can
just seems
will.
like a non-starter.
Yeah.
Nobody who is capable of doing it will do it,
Mm,
and nobody who would be willing to do it is capable of doing it.
Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, like they successfully made several new collaborator gangs across Gaza, Palestinians, but they're really
They're
small and
they're
they're not
small
capable.
and and they, are easily captured and dealt with. So it's it continues to be an incredibly bleak situation. And yeah, as you said, Ali, you know, the, all of the elements that need to happen in order to stop Israel have to be escalated at this point. Activism, protests, sanctions, boycotts, campaigns to to bring the perpetrators of this genocide and this project of Zionism to account, to isolate it, and to force it to stop killing Palestinians and taking their land. Um, so yeah, like Iman was saying, this is not over. The genocide is ongoing. It's transforming now into a different scale, and it is up to us to fight against the normalization of these lower intensity
Yeah, they're looking for
phases of it.
sustainable genocide, not
Yes,
sustainable peace, but
right.
politically sustainable genocide,
Yeah,
and that depends on people going back to sleep and turning away from
right.
Gaza and forgetting about it.
Yeah,
If we don't do that, then they will
yeah,
not succeed.
yeah, absolutely.